Hi, folks. Thanks for being with us today for our webcast, OSHA's First Aid Requirements, sponsored by JJ Keller. We are going to let our audience members settle in for just a minute before we start the presentation, and we'll start shortly. Thank you. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us today for our JJ Keller webinar. We are going to let our audience members settle in for just a few more moments, and then we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast, OSHA's First Aid Requirements, FAQs Answered, sponsored by JJ Keller. My name is Barry Botino, and I'm an associate editor at Safety and Health. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's event. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to share with everyone. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or the magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we will conduct a Q&A with our speakers. If you have a question, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, and press the send button. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin to send in your question. We welcome those questions at any time during today's event. After this presentation, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, but I'll tell you more about that a little later. Finally, this webcast will be archived. If you want to view this presentation or any of our past webcasts, please go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's introduce our speakers today. With us are Ray Chishti and Cindy Pauley. Ray joined JJ Keller in 2017 as a workplace safety editor. His expertise includes safety responsibilities in retail, warehouse facilities, construction, railways, electrical transmission, and fossil fuel power plants. He's an OSHA authorized trainer for general industry and construction, and he has 15 years of experience as an EHS professional. Cindy is an associate editor on the EHS publishing team. In her role, she develops a wide variety of content and provides regulatory insight for JJ Keller's customers and partners. For more than a decade, Cindy has worked in safety program development and management in the oil and gas, chemical, manufacturing, construction, and agricultural industries. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. Now I'll hand it over to Ray to kick off today's event.
All right, thank you, Barry. Appreciate that, and welcome, everybody. As Barry mentioned, today's webcast was certainly made possible by the all-new JJ Keller Compliance Network. The JJ Keller Compliance Network offers a wide range of tools and resources to help their businesses keep up with the ever-changing regulations and expand their compliance knowledge on the topics that are important to them. Features include compliance resources, news and trending issues, consulting directly with our experts, peer discussion forums, and much, much more. And again, on behalf of JJ Keller Compliance Network, thank you everybody for joining us today. All right, let's get into, I like to discuss up front kind of what we're going to be covering. And my co-host Cindy will be joining us here shortly as well. So we'll be piloting through this interesting topic on first aid. We're certainly going to be talking about all of the applicable standards, both on the OSHA side of the fence, as well as non-consensus standards, things like ANSI and ADIA. We'll be talking about first aid, what that means in your workplace, emergency care, what you should be thinking through, how you should be planning for that. We'll be discussing what supplies and kits you need, where to place them. We'll also be discussing CPR, AED requirements that you could use to develop and build your own first aid program in your workplace. And then we're going to reserve some time here at the tail end of today's webcast for questions and answers. So don't be shy, send Cindy and I your questions, and we would be more than happy to answer them. Let's jump into employer responsibilities. I think this is really a great place to start. Get lots of questions about this, but the first thing to keep in mind is that OSHA requires employers to provide that safe and healthy workplace, right? And needs to be free, reasonably free of occupational hazards. However, it's a little unrealistic to expect accidents not to happen. And so we tell employers that they're going to have to provide access to emergency medical care, things like first aid supplies, and they need to match the conditions of the workplace. And so depending upon what industry you're working in or work activities that are going on in your facility, your workplace, you need to make sure that you have the appropriate supplies and programs. And we'll be talking about that today with you. The specifics of how an employer provides emergency medical care is going to be important. Those first aid supplies, which ones you choose, again, are going to be dependent upon the conditions we'll be discussing here with you today. So let's talk a bit about how this applies, right? The first aid standard certainly applies to all employers in general industry. And you don't have to have a minimum number of employees for the standard to apply. And the standard applies to situations, whether really you're in an office setting or you're in a factory, perhaps you're in some sort of an industrial setting, this standard is going to be applicable to your workplace. There are some variances. The standard does not apply to state or local government or to employees who fall under the jurisdiction of other federal agencies. Although I'd like you to remember that these other federal agencies could voluntarily adopt OSHA regulations. We've seen that with the U.S. Postal Service as they follow OSHA standards, and they're treated just like any other private employer, all the way up to receiving monetary fines if they're in non-compliance for a specific OSHA standard. Also, I like to throw this plug out: the U.S. military branches are not covered by OSHA regulations. However, again, if individual branches of the military choose to establish their own policy, they can, or choose to follow suit with OSHA. So let's get into the specific standard. I like to throw the citation up on the slide here so you know where we're talking about. 1910-151, that's going to be the citation for you to refer to for first aid requirements. And, the standard itself really doesn't provide much detail. If you look at the standard, it's really only 3 paragraphs long, and it's pretty short. I think it's about 100 words. And the standard covers the topics of things like workplace medical consultation, talks about some employer responsibilities on providing emergency medical care, providing first aid supplies and how they have to be readily available. Also touches on emergency eye washes and showers. So all the important information, for example, the how-to first aid in the workplace really has to be found in other OSHA material, other documentation that we'll be discussing here with you shortly. All right, so the wording, again, itself in the standard, right, doesn't specifically address the issues of the number of emergency responders that you have to have. And we get asked this a lot of questions, a lot of times. How many first responders do I have to have in my workplace? Certainly things like what training do they have to have? The type and the amount of first aid supplies. Do they need to include an AED? So there are several OSHA standards which do have a specific first aid component to them, and we'll be discussing those here with you as well. So just to give you some more idea of things that are not specifically addressed in this OSHA standard. All right, so a little bit more information. Here's some of those resources of information that I was talking about. These are sources that are going to provide us with more details of the hows and the whys of your first aid program. I like to look at the letters of interpretations. You know, the non-mandatory Appendix A to the standard, 1910-151, another great resource, not mandatory, but provides volumes of information for us to glean from to develop our first aid plan. There's a best practice guide, which is the fundamentals of a workplace first aid program. And then there's those third-party consensus standards like ANSI, and we'll be talking more about that here with you. But I'd like to allow my co-host Cindy to jump in and take the reins here.
Why, thanks, Ray, and thank you to everybody that's joining us today. We know your schedules are completely full, as everybody else's are, so we are grateful that you've decided to join us for this hour or so. And so as Ray's talking about the standard here, I did want to point out that paragraph A of the standard, which as he mentioned was 1910-151, that's for general industry. And this requires you to have medical personnel, what they call readily available. So what this really means is a doctor, an occupational nurse, or even local emergency responders can be consulted about things like the type and amount of first aid supplies and any other aspects of the plant health program. Now they talk about plant health in that description there. And what they really mean by that really is just overall health and safety of, or the condition of the employees in the facility. So that's what they mean by plant health. So it's really the people. Many employers have an existing contract with an occupational doctor or a clinic for pre-employment physicals. A lot of people are going that route. Some even have in-house and they can do required health screening there. But the medical professional should also review a first aid written program or a plan. They also want to, you want to talk over with them the type and number of supplies that might be needed and any AED program that, that the workplace first aid training program might want to incorporate as well. So the next slide, please. Now, paragraph B may be part of the standard that causes the most questions to come up. So this one can be a little bit confusing. Ray yeah, there we go. Thank you. So the definition you can see here on the screen now, it basically requires the employer to provide prompt first aid treatment for injured employees. Now, this is either having trained first aiders on the site at the workplace or by making sure that local emergency responders can be at the work site within a reasonable amount of time. And we'll talk about times here in a little bit because that does trip people up a little bit as well. Now, the paragraph also requires that adequate first aid supplies are readily available. Now, they use the word adequate. And that kind of brings up even more questions for people. So let's talk about that. Now, in some letters of interpretation, OSHA says that to meet the requirement of the standard, emergency care must be available within no more than 3 to 4 minutes of a workplace where there could be some serious accidents or the likelihood of serious accidents. Now, those are going to be the ones that include falls, suffocations, electrocution, amputations, so serious incidents like that. So that means that if serious incidents are likely to occur in your workplace, outside emergency medical services must be able to get to you within 3 to 4 minutes, or you will need to have trained responders on site. So for workplaces like offices where maybe less serious work-related injuries are more likely, then OSHA exercises discretion in enforcing first aid requirements. And they say that really no longer a response time of up to maybe 15 minutes may be reasonable for areas like offices where, like I said, there's less serious incidents might occur. Now, outside emergency responders can be trained EMTs, local ambulance services, or any suitably trained medical responders. So they don't dictate exactly who you use, but those are typically the ones that you would rely on for outside assistance. So speaking of relying on outside assistance, if you just decide to go that route, there are a few things that you'll want to keep in mind. So first, before you use the outside response agency, you want to contact them and make arrangements with them or have an agreement in place prior to using their services, because you want to make sure that they can respond in a timely fashion, and that they have the capacity to provide that service to your establishment. So even though there may be a fire department, say just down the street, you want to make sure that you make prior arrangements with them. Sometimes they're volunteer agencies, they could be out on other calls, so there could be some issues there with response. Now, second, as part of those arrangements, an employer must ensure that the provider will be available, like I just mentioned, and that includes for all work days and all shifts. So keep that in mind. It's not just a regular 8 to 5 scenario that you'll want to consider here. And you can't assume that they will always be available, like I said, especially if they're a volunteer department or short-staffed, or any number of things in the way the employment situation is in today's economic times. And then finally, make sure that the provider has a necessary capacity to meet your needs. So if the provider you use, such as an ambulance service, only has one ambulance, and that ambulance could be in use, say, to transport a patient to or from other hospitals, or they're out on another call or another run, they can't be available to respond to your emergencies. So you can't really rely on them to provide your emergency response. So these are all things that you'll want to consider, talk to them about, put together an agreement, make arrangements, and things like that. So I'm going to bounce back to Ray now to go over response times, as I promised. Ray?
Absolutely. Yeah, and with the response times, I usually recommend that you do a mock scenario. This is really the time to kind of button up any gaps or any issues. When I was in the field, I typically would do several mock scenarios just to find out how long it took for services to come, any kinks in my program, any gaps, but I highly recommend it. And if you do decide to use these out responders, again, this would be a great time to do that mock scenario. A lot of times I've seen volunteer services where the responders are working a day job, they get a call, they're responding from somewhere, that kind of a thing. Also, you must not discourage, remember this, any trained employees from offering first aid as Good Samaritans, even if they haven't been really designated as a workplace responder in your facility. If you discourage trained employees from offering aid, it would actually violate the OSHA standards. So you want to make sure that, again, even if they're not identified as a first responder, if they're wanting to under that Good Samaritan hat, that you're allowing them to do so, okay? On this next slide here, getting more into some of the standards requirements, I like to splash this letters of interpretation information out, but there was an LOI dated December 11th, 1996, and in it, OSHA was asked by an employer whether they would be in violation if their workplace policy required employees to just simply call 911 in an emergency situation. And so OSHA said that the employees should not be discouraged or prevented from calling 911. And the purpose of first aid is to, remember, give employees or your injured workers some level of medical attention as quickly as possible. And we're trying to bridge the gap between the accident and full medical treatment. So rendering first aid should be encouraged by trained employees in addition to calling 911 if warranted. In this particular letters of interpretation, or this case, an employer would not be in violation of OSHA's first aid standard by issuing such a policy statement, as long as the statement that was issued does not discourage the rendering of first aid by trained employees. All right. On-site responders. Let's talk about that here a bit. So some standards, as I mentioned earlier, do have those specific requirements to have trained first aid responders either on-site or in-house, all right? And so some examples, if you're in the logging industry or you're in the electric power generation side of the fence, those would be two examples. Now, the logging standard requires mandatory first aid training for logging employees, and on the electric side of the fence, the standard requires that you have persons trained in first aid at work locations in the electric power industry. So again, the information that we're providing here will apply to most employers. If you're in a specific industry, you want to make sure that you pay attention to those specific industry-specific standards for additional requirements. All right, let's talk a moment about employer responsibility. This is another area where we get lots of questions, and so we like to hone in here. But in other OSHA letters of interpretations that we've seen, the agency certainly answers questions of whether employers would be cited if a trained employee were to forget their training, right? So now something's happening. You have a first responder that was trained and they're not executing their training properly. What happens? And so OSHA responded that if a trained employee were to panic, for example, and this happens quite a bit, in an emergency situation, the adrenaline's pumping, the blood pressure's rising, and they don't administer first aid, or they administer first aid, but it's improperly done. OSHA, in this case, would not cite the employer. The employer has met, so in this situation, would have met the obligation under the standard to provide an individual trained to render first aid. The standard only requires that employers or employees be trained in first aid, but doesn't address the actual performance of first aid in emergency situations. And so OSHA would more than likely conduct an investigation, and if that was deemed necessary to ensure that proper first aid and CPR training and certifications were in order, the employee wouldn't, more than likely would not receive additional citations. So with that, let's jump into readily available. I think this is another hot topic. How about you, Cindy?
Yeah, it is a hot topic. And thanks for that good information, Ray. That's very interesting on that deer in the headlights, so to speak, is what we like to say it when I worked as a dispatcher. So let's talk about readily available. I mentioned that earlier, and you're going to see that popping up all over the place. So we're just going to kind of help define that a little bit more. And what OSHA says in 1910-151 is paragraph B, that you must have adequate first aid supplies available, but it really doesn't provide more guidance than that. Now, the reason they do that is they want to give employers the flexibility and leeway to compare what their hazards are to what their needs will be. They won't want to require everything under the sun because you may not need that. That's just a waste of money, things like that. So in looking at other sources, we find another letter of interpretation dated February 2nd back to 2007 that states that the employer has persons who are trained in first aid, then adequate first aid supplies must be made available for use. So keeping in mind, not only do you choose what you need to have available, you also choose, you need to have those available when you have somebody trained to do first aid so that they can access what they need. However, I've spoken to several OSHA compliance officers who've told me that they expect employers to have basic first aid supplies available, even if they don't have designated first aid responders on site, despite what the letter of interpretation says. So safe side of things, have some first aid supplies available as related to what hazards you have in your workplace. Now, if you're interested in accessing free resources and content on first aid that we're talking about here today, you're in luck because JJ Keller's Compliance Network is sponsoring today's event. So we're actually offering limited time access to all the content and the resources in our platform. So you should see a poll on your slide right now. If you're interested in taking advantage of that, please go ahead and answer the poll questions for us, and we'll make sure that we get that information to you. And if you'd like complimentary access to this brand new online solution, again, the poll has different selections that you can take there. And as a thank you, we'll email a copy of our brand new white paper that is titled Workplace Safety, Be Informed, Be Proactive, Be Compliant. Now, back to the term readily available. It's really not defined in the standard much more than those words. And OSHA says, again, another letter of interpretation, that it uses the same 3 to 4 minute response time for providing first aid to apply to making first aid supplies readily available. So again, that 3 to 4 minutes is what they are considering that, especially like we said, in areas that have the higher severity injury potential. So in other words, trained employees who will be rendering first aid in your establishment must have access to the first aid supplies they'll need to provide care. And those first aid supplies should be located in an easily accessible area. And the first aid provider, they should generally not have to travel through any barricades like doorways or hallways or having to go up and down stairs to access the supplies. So you really want to make that easy for them to access as well. So readily and easily accessible. Now, we also get a lot of questions on the subject of first aid supplies. So let's take a look at that topic a little bit more in depth. As we mentioned, OSHA doesn't provide details in the standard, so we really have to rely on other sources that you can see here on the screen. We have to look first at Appendix A, the Best Practices Guide, and ANSI 308.1. OSHA does refer quite often back to Z3081 from ANSI. Now, none of these are mandatory, but they do provide us with more information that can be found in the standard. So just a few resources there for you to keep in mind. Now, looking further into which supplies you'll need, OSHA says that it's the employer's responsibility to make an assessment of the workplace. So you'll want to do a risk assessment and determine the type of incidents that occur and provide first aid supplies that are adequate for the workplace. Kind of talked about that already a little bit. And again, there's another letter of interpretation dated August 4th, 1994, that says you are required to provide supplies that are appropriate and that are specific to the needs of the workplace. So in other words, you'll want to assess what could happen in your workplace, what types of injuries, and then figure out what supplies would be needed to, help with those injuries. So if we look at Appendix A, it states that employers should apply reasonably anticipated supplies based on the injuries noted in the establishment's 300 log. So if you're wondering what sorts of injuries you're having and you don't know which supplies to put in your cabinets, that's probably the best place to go is your 300 log, and that will tell you exactly what types of things that are going on. So for example, if you have been logging a lot of burns, you'll want to up the ante on how many supplies you have for treating burns. And the best practices guide that I mentioned says first aid supplies should reflect the kinds of injuries that occur. So again, all these resources that we've given you are going back to the same thing. Perform a risk assessment, review what injuries you're having or near misses that you're having, assess what supplies will be needed to help care for those. So really reviewing that past injury history and also, like I mentioned before, consulting with medical professionals helps determine what supplies you should have. Rely on them. If you're hiring them to be a resource, then make sure that they're helping you decide what you need. Now, while federal OSHA does not require that you have a doctor's approval of your first aid supply list, some state plans actually do, such as California. Cal OSHA says that employers must have adequate first aid materials approved by the consulting physician readily available. So those of you that are in state plan states, you'll want to also double check that. And periodically, you'll want to check your first aid supplies so that used items are getting replaced. So you'll want to check for expiration dates, and you want to adjust supplies based upon demand. Some things are being used more often. Again, that's a trigger to maybe look into what types of injuries you're having out there. But the best practices guide suggests that one person in the workplace have responsibility for the first aid supplies to make it easier and more consistent to track them. Now that's really up to you who that person would be. It could be a coordinator, it could be just an employee that's interested in this that you wanted to assign to do that, get them involved in the safety more. They don't really tell you who that person has to be. So just pick somebody that's logical or that wants to get more involved in safety at your workplace. Now, the bloodborne pathogen standard requires that you have PPE. So there are other associated requirements out there as well, like gloves, masks, eye protection, and things like that. These should be included with your first aid supplies if your workplace responders will be exposed to blood or bodily fluids in the course of their employment or the task, the first aid tasks that they will be providing. Now, OSHA does provide us a starting point as far as having first aid supplies in referring us to the ANSI Z308.1 that I mentioned earlier. It's called the Workplace First Aid Kits and Supplies. And their latest version is 2021, but they haven't adopted this version or updated its guidance about it. Ray's going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So I'm going to bounce that back over to him just to talk a little bit about ANSI and first aid kits a little bit more.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, just some more tidbits here about ANSI Z308.1. So we should start by saying that, again, I'd like to keep on reminding folks that make sure that you understand whether or not OSHA has adopted the consensus standard. And if they have, then it's called adoption by reference. And so the standard here that Cindy's talking about, the ANSI Z308.1, that's the Workplace First Aid Kits and Supplies standard, has not been adopted by OSHA, okay? But OSHA refers employers to it as a source of guidance. And so if you remember at the beginning of the webcast, we said, hey, the standard really just is 100 words. It doesn't have a whole lot of information. This would be another tidbit to put in your toolbox to help glean what the requirements are and what you could include in your program. So ANSI, the latest version is the 2021 standard, and it includes classes of kits, something that you're probably familiar with, the Class A, Class B. Class A is going to be for really the most common types of workplace injuries. Class B, larger site, it has more quantity. It's really for your more complex, high-risk environment. As of 2021, the standard does require some additional requirements, in particular, requiring foil blankets for both classes of first aid kits. And I think we get sometimes situations where clients may have not realized that this particular ANSI standard has been updated. It was actually approved last year in April and became effective in October of 2022. Again, OSHA has not adopted it, but certainly, use the standard as a point of reference. Besides the foil blanket requirement, this new 2021 standard does provide some guidance on bleeding control. And so that gives specifics about, different potential hazards, types of injuries, bleeding controls, those sorts of things. The other new tidbit here with this 2021 standard is it breaks down the specific types of containers into 4 types. And so whether you're indoors, outdoors, you need a portable kit, you need a waterproof kit, there's really 4 different types of containers that are in play here now that ANSI recognizes under this new updated standard. So if you're looking for information, definitely look at that Z308.1, but go ahead and refer to that 2021 version. All right, some more about first aid kits, another big area we get lots of questions about. Neither OSHA nor ANSI really addresses first aid kits specifically, only that you have to have these first aid supplies readily available. And there's no regulatory requirement to have a certain number of kits or really where the kits have to be placed. And so OSHA only says that adequate first aid supplies have to be readily available, nor is there a requirement really that your first aid kit has to be mounted on a particular wall. Many employers do, though, mount kits on walls to make sure that the supplies are there when they're needed and that the first aid kit isn't floating around the office or the work environment. It is where it should be. It is the employer's responsibility, remember, to assess the needs of the workplace and tailor first aid kits and their placement to your workplace. OSHA does expect and would expect that the decisions on supplies and kits and locations, placements are made by you, the employer, and that you're taking consulting into consideration. As Cindy had mentioned, medical professionals. Cindy had also mentioned, when providing, making sure that we have facilities in near proximity or first aid readily available, that letters of interpretation. OSHA points us to that 3 to 4 minute margin for serious injuries and 15 minutes for office environments. I like to use that as my placeholder for deciding how far or how close to place my first aid kit. And so I usually tell clients, you could use that rule of thumb, 3 to 4 minutes if you're in a work environment where you need access to your kits within the 3 to 4 minutes. If you're in an office setting, you're good up to 15 minutes. And again, I can't stress enough to make sure that you're practicing your mock, have some mock scenarios. Practice makes perfect. All right, we received a question regarding an audit of a workplace by their insurance company. This is another little area that I like to throw out there. Look at your commercial liability policy. So this goes beyond OSHA, goes beyond the consensus standards that we're talking about, but look at your commercial insurance policy. Sometimes there's some things buried in the policy that come to fruition here concerning either first aid kits or your first aid program. But here in particular, the employer had said that they were written up for having expired products in their first aid kit. Now, this particular employer had acknowledged it was obviously a best practice to remove expired items from the first aid kit, but that there wasn't anything really specific in the OSHA standard where having expired products is prohibited. And this particular employer would be correct. Nothing in 1910-151 speaks to expired products. But OSHA says that only adequate first aid supplies shall be readily available. And really nothing in the best practice guide that Cindy was talking about speaks to expired products. However, we do, as we mentioned, we look to these consensus standards, and the ANSI tells us that really any first aid supply beyond its marked expiration date should be removed from the kit and replaced. So we're prohibited from having these outdated supplies in the kits. Also, if you look at the manufacturer's recommendations, they don't advise using the products beyond the expiration date. Also refer to your health statutes that could be in your local jurisdiction. And if you're under a state's plan, such as California or Oregon or other states that have a state approved plan, you want to look for specifics there as well. All right. So OSHA says in a still valid letters of interpretation, again, we glean information from lots of places, and I like to look at the letters of interpretation because these are actual employers like you that are out there experiencing issues, and they get to ask OSHA, and OSHA gives us these replies. But another LOI, this one in particular dated January 23rd, 2007, says that first aid cabinets may be locked. However, they must be readily accessible in the event of an emergency. And so we get this question quite often: can I lock my first aid cabinet? So locking the cabinet, you have to realize, could limit accessibility, right? And we've learned that the first aid supplies need to be readily accessible. So employees are actually allowed to lock up their first aid supplies as long as those supplies can be obtained quickly if needed. OSHA doesn't provide really any other guidance on this issue. If you need a key to get to the first aid supplies, then the key must be available. If the person with the key for that day or that shift went off site or couldn't be found, then you wouldn't be in compliance. And so I highly recommend that if you're going to lock your first aid supplies up, you issue gatekeeper one a key, make sure you have additional gatekeepers. So that way, if the primary gatekeeper is not there, for whatever reason, you have additional resources to get the first aid supplies available to injured workers. All right, AEDs, another big area we get lots of questions about. So OSHA does not require that you have an AED. Certainly, OSHA recognizes the life-saving abilities of having an AED in your workplace, and so they're highly recommended. However, not a requirement. I will tell you that the AEDs, they are considered a medical device, and so the FDA, another agency, has jurisdiction over medical devices and requires that you have a prescription. And those prescriptions, typically you get those from the vendor that you purchase the AED unit from. There's been times where I've started a new job, nobody knew where the prescription was, and I called up, a local physician and worked out the prescription issue. But you do need a prescription, and OSHA doesn't have requirements, policies, rules, standards about AEDs. Those are going to come from your local jurisdiction. Your state will actually have training requirements, placement requirements. If you're in a particular industry, they'll specify whether you do or do not need one, that sort of thing. And so we like to gravitate folks to their local jurisdiction to see what those requirements are. All right. And with that, Cindy, you want to take us into another hot topic, really, OTC medications?
Absolutely, I will. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about over-the-counter OTCs, more commonly known as, which, like Ray mentioned, we get a lot of questions on. And these are just simply those kinds of medications that anybody can buy at any local drugstore without a prescription, and you're just interested in offering it to your employees and under certain circumstances. So while OSHA doesn't specifically require or prohibit OTC meds to be included in your first aid kits, there are considerations that should be made to ensure overall OSHA compliance. For example, the general duty clause, which requires you to keep employees safe from recognized hazards. Now, the reason I bring up the general duty clause is that there could be situations that you need to think about that might be outside of just you offering these. So for example, the ANSI standard says that if you offer over-the-counter medications in your first aid kit, they should be packaged in single dose, tamper evident packaging, and the medication should not contain any ingredients that are known to cause drowsiness. The last thing you want to have is to have an employee out there that's taken something over the counter that you've offered and then have them operating a powered industrial truck if that medication is going to cause drowsiness. So that's why they put that in there. You could also have an employee that had allergic reaction to something that was supplied by the employer, or worse yet, were to take some home to a family member and then that family member were to have a reaction. So again, several things to consider before you decide whether or not you want to include those in your first aid kits. But OSHA does not tell you you can or you cannot. Now, some companies started offering medications in vending machines, while others don't offer them at all. Again, state laws can also affect your level of responsibility, so you'll want to consult again with your legal representative or medical professional on that topic. So overall, the decision to include over-the-counter meds in a workplace cabinet and kit should really be based on a very, very careful assessment of the risks and benefits, and should really be in consultation with your medical professional, as I said. So I did want to kind of dive a little bit more into some of those things to consider. We talked a little bit about medications that cause drowsiness, but there are also things like employees need to be aware that the medications are available in the cabinets and how to properly use them. So there's a little bit going to be more training involved if you're going to provide OTCs. This may include, the training might include stuff like how to use the medication, proper dosages, any potential side effects or possible interactions with other medications they may be taking. You want to make sure, Ray just talked about expired stuff. So you don't want to make sure medications are not expired. They don't have any other potential health concerns. You may start to have to keep track of recall notices in some cases. OTC meds you provide should be limited to use by employees, because the inability to provide training to non-employees really could present a risk for you for unknown health issues or side effects as well. And then lastly, you want to really make sure that employees understand that they're not required to take any of those medications if you've provided them. For example, they should not feel as though they're going to be forced to take an over-the-counter medication as a means of preventing them from leaving work due to feeling ill or experiencing any pain. So just some things to think about on OTCs there. Again, we get a lot of questions on those, so we like to be upfront with some of the suggestions and recommendations. Now, moving on to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about first aid rooms, which is another issue related to first aid supplies that we get, and specifically what regulations apply to first aid rooms. So as with most first aid related topics, the standard doesn't address first aid rooms in your workplace. Some state plan programs may have specific requirements that OSHA doesn't. So you'll want to consult with your medical professional, who will probably more than likely be able to provide you with advice on how to set it up, if you need one, things like that. Otherwise, when it comes to first aid rooms, just really OSHA leaves it up to the employer's best judgment. Now, we talked a little bit about some training, and I see we're getting a lot of questions on training, so we'll dive into a little bit of that right now. Now, OSHA doesn't teach first aid courses, nor do they certify first aid training courses for instructors or trainees. What they do instead is point out that training for first aid is offered by associations like the American Heart Association, American Red Cross, the National Safety Council, and other nationally recognized or private educational organizations. Now, they do state in a letter of interpretation that any nationally accepted and medically sound first aid program that covers the fundamentals of first aid will meet the requirements of the standard, the 1910-151 standard. Now, the specific content of first aid programs must be consistent, though, with your work environment and with the type of work that's being done. So again, you have to still assess what's going on in your specific facilities. And first aid training courses should include instruction in general first aid principles, as well as workplace hazard specific knowledge and skills. So there are a number of elements that you'll want to include when you're planning a first aid training program for a particular workplace, such as those shown here. So you'll want hands-on skills, resources, provide them with resources for reference during and after training, emphasize some commonly occurring situations. Again, that's where that 300A log can come in. Use those as examples in your training. And then also put an emphasis on quick response to first aid situations, that 3 to 4 minute time frame that we're talking about. Now, if you are doing CPR training too, just one other note is it should incorporate AED training. We've mentioned that AEDs are not part of the OSHA standard right now, but the CPR training should incorporate AED training if you have an AED available at the work site. So not saying that you have to train for AED, only if you have those on the work site do you need to do that training. But first aid training should be repeated periodically. You want to make sure that employees are maintaining and updating their knowledge and skills. Remember, what we don't use, we lose. So just keep that in mind as well. Now, also a first aid training program must include instructor observation of various hands-on skills, along with written performance assessments. So instructor-led retraining for life-saving emergencies should occur at least annually, with retraining for non-life-threatening responses occurring periodically. So that's really going to kind of be, again, you don't want people to lose the skills. So a periodic training there is best recommended. Now, because we have those long intervals and understanding what adult learning is like, numerous studies have shown that a retention rate of only 6 to 12 months is what we have for these critical skills. So that's why it's so important to have regular periodic training on these, is because I can't say it enough. If we don't use it, we definitely lose it. So, and the American Heart Association's Emergency Cardiovascular Care Committee, they have provided that 6 month time frame, and they say that review and practice sessions at least every 6 months for CPR and AED skills are actually what works best. So to be in compliance with the standard, employers must ensure that the trained person or persons have the ability to read medical documentation, including safety data sheets, labels, and medication and antidotes, along with medical alert bracelets if anybody has those, or bands on their arms, which could be referenced to render proper first aid to injured employees in your workplace. So all those resources, they need to be able to read and understand what the things mean there. So these abilities can best be demonstrated by means of a written test. It is, however, the ability to read the necessary information that's critical to compliance, not the means by which the ability is tested. So a lack of a written test does not by itself establish a violation of the standard if the ability can be demonstrated in some other fashion. So again, it's OSHA giving you a little bit of leeway to use whatever process is best for you and your workforce. Now, in addition to 1910-151, several OSHA standards have specific training requirements for first aid. And you can see those listed here that require both first aid and CPR training. So obviously, the higher the risk, the more requirements that OSHA would like to see out there for requirements for trained people to render first aid. Now, a question that often comes up is whether computer-based training or retraining without the hands-on skills component or verification of competent skills performance by a qualified trainer would be acceptable for meeting the intent of the standards requirements. OSHA points out in the letter of interpretation, again, we keep going back to these because they are very valuable pieces of information. They have actually clarified that online first aid training alone, if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you, Ray. The online first aid training alone would not meet the requirements of the OSHA standard. OSHA says that basic first aid and CPR requirements of the OSHA standard, the 1910-151, which is medical services and first aid, the 1910-146 permit required confined spaces, 1910-266 logging, 1910 electrical power generation, all the ones that we listed on the slides before, do require training in physical skills such as bandaging and CPR. The only way these physical skills can be learned is by actually practicing them. So that's why OSHA requires that. A first aid training program should have trainees develop hands-on skills through the use of mannequins and partner practice. So it could be either or, it could be a combination of both. Usually it ends up being both. Especially when you use outside agencies to provide the training, they'll typically use both mannequins and partner practice. Now, during COVID-19, which is kind of going away, but we still need to keep an eye on it, training providers may have some offered some alternative training options, such as offering an online portion now and hands-on portion later. You will want to check with your state or with your training provider to see how they are specifically approaching the first aid training requirements. But as long as there is both, the timing in between should be relatively close to one another, but they really don't have exact standards or requirements for that. But you could do one now and one later. We get that question quite often. Ray, I think I'm going to bounce it back to you about a little bit more about CPR training.
Yeah, terrific stuff, Cindy. Couldn't agree more. Practice makes perfect. CPR training, if you're choosing to have your first responders perform CPR, if warranted, make sure that they're properly trained. Nowadays, you can take the online portion, but then you need to go in. Many of the national recognized organizations, third-party organizations, will have a two-step component over the computer, and then you got to go in and do a performance evaluation. There are certain standards. For example, if you're in permit required confined spaces where the CPR training would be required, there's other standards depending upon your work activities where they could be required. Highly recommended by OSHA for its life-saving properties in suit with AEDs. And then remember that there's instructor-led training too. So a lot of times I would get the train the trainer, and I would come back to my workplace facility and I would make sure that I was a resource to train other workers, other supervisors who needed it. Up here on your screen are those other standards. So if you're, again, in those permit required confined spaces, you got logging, the electric industry, the 269 standard. If you have a dive team, if that's applicable, and then transmission and distribution and construction also sees the particular requirements. Bloodborne pathogens, I like to remind folks that, if you have situations where workers could be exposed to bodily fluids with visible blood, this could be triggered 1910-1030, and they may need vaccinations. It's a three-step process, and so schedule accordingly. There's also if your workers don't want to be vaccinated, there's a declination form that they would need to fill out, and you can keep that on file. But certainly, as you're making your assessments of your workplace, do make sure that you see if this bloodborne pathogen standard would be applicable to your workplace situation. Now here with the safety data sheet, I like to include this too. We're talking about first aid, but the safety data sheets, if your workers are working with chemicals and they're exposed to the chemicals, and we're calling our first responders or 911, they're going to want to know what they were exposed to. And so the ingredient list is certainly in the safety data sheet. There is a first aid section on what to do if there is exposure. And so I like to remind folks to make sure that they have the safety data sheets readily available. Cindy, you want to talk about hazardous locations?
I do. Especially since I'm very close to a lot of firefighters and responders from being back in my day. And so when you're going to provide training for first responders, keep in mind any hazardous locations that you have in the workplace. You don't want to send responders through into a hazardous situation, or you'll have more victims than you do responders. So if they may have to provide care for accident victims in those hazardous locations, then the responders must be trained on the hazards of the location. So let them know what they could be getting into, what they may be surrounded by. And again, this is part of what I was talking about earlier about making arrangements with your responders, especially if you're using outside agencies. That's the stuff you want to cover with them, is this is what we have here and this is where we have there. So go over that with them in the training as well. Even your in-house folks can be, it's a good time to remind them as well. Now, responders will have to be trained on necessary PPE, don't forget, for entering those locations, and have rapid access to the PPE in the emergency situations. So same as any other responder, we talked about that earlier, the PPE also needs to be easily accessible, readily available. So again, it comes down to making an assessment in the workplace and taking those into account, and then doing some proper training and making PPE decisions for the crew. Now, OSHA was asked how the first aid standard affected situations where there were employees who were working alone. Does that same 3 to 4 minute response time apply? And if I'm not mistaken, I think I saw a question come through on this, so it's pretty good timing. Now, in all general industry situations, the first aid standard applies, including the section on availability of medical personnel and first aid supplies. OSHA says, excuse me, that whether or not employees can work alone without regard to the 3 to 4 minute response time will depend upon the hazards and upon the standards that apply. For example, the electrical generating standard requires that employees exposed to electric shock must have emergency care within 4 minutes, no ifs, ands, or buts. There are also standards which require that there be first aid available, so employees would not be allowed to work alone in those situations. Now, working alone may also be covered under some state plan state requirements as well. So again, if you're in one of those state plan states, you'll want to make sure that you're checking on what's required for you. Sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. So let's talk, talk a little.
How about we let you take a peek at the questions? There's a lot of questions coming in and I can wrap it up here.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, give you a chance to breathe there. Remember, folks, keep your program current, as we've been talking about, whether it's the mock drills, the regulations, all the guidance as you're building your program, make sure that you're keeping your program current, making those annual assessments at the very least, ensuring that you have the latest and greatest information available. Just as a quick recap, we went through a lot of the common questions that we get, shared those with you, talked about OSHA, the consensus standards, first aid, emergency care, how and when to get your first aid supplies, and the good old CPR and AED requirements. We really hope, Cindy and I and everybody here hope that you gained some valuable information. Before we move on to those questions that Cindy's sifting through, we'd like to thank our event sponsor, J.J. Keller Compliance Network, for making today's event possible. Today's businesses are subject to many regulations across multiple agencies. This brand new platform delivers our renowned brand of compliance knowledge and expertise, personalized to your exact regulatory needs. You're going to see a poll up there. We'd like to send you complimentary access to Compliance Network. Use this poll and select your interest, and as a big thank you, we'll email you a copy of our brand new white paper, Workplace Safety. Be informed, be proactive, be compliant. And with that, Barry, you want to jump into some questions here?
Absolutely, Ray. Thank you so much. And thank you to Cindy for your vast knowledge with us here today. Before we start the Q&A, I want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey. We're asking you to complete that survey. We'll open in a different screen after this webinar. And your input is very important to us because it does help us to improve our future webcasts. Now let's get to some of those questions. And Ray, I'm going to start with you. Joseph asks about the recent update, the 2021 update to Z308.1, and wondering about new supplies that may be required in every first aid kit. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. The big one is going to be the foil blanket. There is a guide now to help employers about controlling bleeding. There's additional types available. So if you have an indoor setting, an outdoor setting, there's going to be container requirements. Just remember that OSHA doesn't mandate that you follow the 2021 update. It's the best guidance. I highly recommend that you talk to your vendors about what they have available, your workplace situation, and find the best solution.
Sure. And Cindy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just wanted to mention the bleeding control part of it too. I believe the tourniquet changed as well, because previously the tourniquets were more like what you would see when you were giving a blood sample in a phlebotomist lab, and now it's more used for actual bleeding control, like more of a tourniquet.
Great, thank you for adding that, appreciate it. We'll move on to the next question, Cindy, for you about OTC medications. And Kathy asks, if an employer has a vending machine and purchases an OTC, is training still needed on dosage and common side effects?
So the vending machine, that's a great question. The vending machine situation is really not like a pay to play kind of thing. It's more of a setup to where you would have, like, your employees would have an ID badge, and it's their normal employee badge, and they use that badge to access the supplies in the vending machine. So it's not charging the employee, but it is helping the company track what supplies are being utilized and who's using those. I hate to say this, but a lot of times employers do that as a cost check measure. If people are using too much of the same thing, they may try to use that to see what issues they're having out there. So it's a way of tracking more than anything. So it's not a charge to the employee. They just track it with their ID, if that makes sense. So
Okay.
because of that, yes, you would still have to do the training
Okay,
if you're
great.
offering
Thank
that.
you. Thank you for that. Ray, we wanted to go to you for a question from Chuck. And he says, regarding trained employees on site, does this mean they have to be assigned or required to respond? Or can the employer train them and leave it voluntary that they respond if they want to or are comfortable doing so?
Yeah, absolutely. You could leave it voluntary, but you have to remember that if they choose not to, you still need to have adequate resources available. So if they opt not to, you need to have a nearby facility in near proximity to take them off site if your on-site folks decide not to.
Okay, thank you for that, Ray. Cindy, want to throw the next question to you, and it's pretty timely here. We just had this discussion in our office. Dave wants to know about expired requirements for AED supplies.
Yeah, there are actually the pads expire. Typically, they last anywhere from a year and a half to maybe 30 months. But typically that's the only thing that does expire. And some AEDs, it depends. You can check with your manufacturer brand, but some of them will actually have an indicator light when it's time to check those pads, not just check the AED, but some also have a light that tells you that the pads are coming due. So just something else to keep in mind. Add that to your check. If you have AEDs, just add it to when you're doing your fire extinguisher checks and first aid cabinets. Just easier to do that all at the same
Okay,
time.
great, thank you. Ray, we've had a couple questions about this. Michael, for example, wants to know about how all this applies to the construction industry specifically.
The Barry, the supplies required in construction?
Just the general first aid requirements, how those apply to the construction industry.
Okay, yeah. I mean, on the construction side of the fence, it's going to be very similar. You're going to be required to have supplies readily available. The difference is going to be you're in a construction setting. You're outdoors primarily. And so when you do your assessment, you're going to have differences. Where are you going to place kits? How close can they be? What type of hazards, what type of injuries are going to be there on those construction job sites. And so what you need in your kit is going to change depending upon the industry, certainly being in construction, and then the types of activities and injuries that are associated with that. But it's the same basic requirement. You're going to need either a first aid kit or an offsite nearby facility.
Great, thank you for that. And it looks like we have time for one more question here. Cindy, I'm going to throw this to you. Two questions that are kind of similar about treatment exemptions. One, Josh asks about hydrofluoric acid, and then Travis asks about OSHA changing its stance on products like Zip Stitch for treating lacerations. Could you answer those for us?
Yeah, I'm not knowing what exactly we're doing with the hydrofluoric acid, depending on if you're doing petroleum refinery or what. There are actually some information bulletins on OSHA's website. So I would like that specific person maybe want to ask through our network offline.
Absolutely.
And we can refer better to where that hazardous information bulletin is for that specific hazard. And then as far as zip sticks go, I'm not really sure on this. Ray may have a different opinion, but zip sticks, for those people that don't really know quite what they are yet, or like they produce an electronic, almost like a zapping thing to, I guess I would call it cauterizing, I suppose you could say.
Mm-hmm.
As far as OSHA, I think it would take them a while to approve that. It would probably, and then it would also probably have to go through the federal or the FDA, just like the AEDs, because it is producing an electric type shock to someone. So it's a little bit higher level of expertise. Ray, I don't know if you've had experience with them. I've not actually had any in any workplaces I've been in the kits yet.
Yeah,
But if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I've used them in the past. I mean, basically to pull wounds, closed. What I typically would do is I would refer to my offsite medical provider, whether it's the physician or my mobile provider, and I would have them come out and kind of do a demonstration to get folks familiar with it. But they are another resource. It's kind of the new mousetrap, so to speak, when it comes to cuts or wound closures.
Great. Thank you for that, Ray. And folks, unfortunately, we've run out of time today. We did get a lot of great questions. We will forward those all on to Ray and to Cindy. And we thank you all for attending today's presentation. And we'd appreciate you taking some time to also share your feedback via our survey. A special thank you goes out today to our awesome presenters, Ray Chishti and Cindy Pauley, and everyone from our team, everyone from our sponsor at JJ Keller. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. Take care, everyone, and have a safe day.